Tomorrow morning, the Federal Reserve suddenly disappears. It cannot print money, adjust interest rates, rescue banks, or respond to a financial crisis. Would America finally be free from central banking? Or would the entire economy completely collapse? Welcome to This Explainer, where we're unpacking a deeply important yet often totally misunderstood institution that sits at the very heart of the United States. If you look at the top of any US dollar bill, you'll see their name. Because while the Treasury actually prints the physical cash, the Federal Reserve is the entity that distributes it. They pull the levers that impact literally everything, from the interest rate on your mortgage to the price of your groceries. So let's dive into this and uncover exactly how they gained all this power and what our world would look like without them.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the economy's unelected chaperone. Who really controls the money? So the Fed has this almost magical ability to inject massive amounts of cash into the financial system. You've probably seen the famous money printer go burr memes that exploded back in 2020. But with that incredible power comes some really heavy responsibility. There's this fantastic quote from a former Federal Reserve chairman who described the Fed as the economy chaperone who has ordered the punch bowl removed just when the party was really warming up. I mean, think about that for a second. Their job isn't to be popular. In fact, their primary job is often to make highly unpopular decisions, like aggressively raising interest rates, just to slow things down and keep the economy from spinning totally out of control. But how did this chaperone get the keys to the party in the first place? To figure that out, we're heading to Section 2, born from bank runs and the panic of 1907. Imagine that hypothetical world where the Fed doesn't exist. Well, back in the early 1900s, that was reality, and bank runs were a totally normal, absolutely terrifying part of life. If a private bank went out of business, your deposits were gone. Poof! So fearful people would literally sprint to their bank to withdraw their cash. But since banks don't keep all that cash on hand, they would fail, which just sparked even more panic. The whole system was incredibly fragile. This really came to a head during the massive panic of 1907. Since there was no central system to save these failing banks, wealthy bankers, most notably JP Morgan, actually had to step in and put up their own personal money to essentially bail out the banking system. It's a crazy anecdote. Leaders looked at this and realized you just cannot run a growing national economy by crossing your fingers and hoping a few wealthy guys will do the right thing during a crisis. We needed a permanent solution. And that solution was the Federal Reserve, created in 1913. It was designed to be a bank for banks. But here's the catch. Americans at the time deeply distrusted the idea of a single, all-powerful central bank located in New York or Washington. So they decentralized it. They created 12 separate regional Federal Reserve banks scattered across the country. Each one independently set its own policies and interest rates and had its own regional president. A really fun fact from our sources, Missouri actually ended up with 2 banks, one in St. Louis and one in Kansas City, thanks to an influential senator. The point is, the power was totally spread out. But, as we'll see in Section 3, that design had a fatal flaw. Let's look at the Great Depression shift and centralizing power in Washington. When the Great Depression hit, that 1913 decentralized structure proved to be a disaster. Historians widely agree that because the regional Federal Reserve banks couldn't get on the same page, their inaction and their decision to keep lending and money circulation way too tight actually made the Depression significantly worse. A modern Fed governor even bluntly admitted, "We did it." The core problem was that nobody was truly in charge. So to fix this utter failure, Congress drastically shifted the power dynamic in 1935. They centralized authority with a newly empowered Washington-based Board of Governors. The days of just letting regional banks figure it out on their own were officially over. And that centralization created the structure we still use today, the FOMC, or the Federal Open Market Committee. When you hear the news talking about a Fed meeting, this is exactly who is in the room. It's a group of 7 board members nominated by the president, plus 5 rotating regional bank presidents. This specific group of people pulls the levers of the U.S. economy, making those massive decisions about interest rates that ultimately affect all of us. Having centralized power is one thing, but keeping it free from politics? That's a whole different story. This brings us to Section 4, Taming the Great Inflation and the 1970s crisis. This crisis was heavily fueled by political pressure. For example, President Nixon leaned really hard on the Fed to keep interest rates artificially low just to help out his 1972 re-election campaign. It was a complete disaster that proved politics and central banking do not mix. So, to try and fix this political vulnerability, Congress gave the Fed a very specific dual mandate in 1978. Their 2 jobs, stable prices and maximum employment. But here is the incredible irony and the inherent conflict between these two goals. When inflation is out of control, the cure, which is crushing inflation by slowing down the economy, almost always forces unemployment to go up. It's a seesaw. You frequently can't fix one without hurting the other.
And right away, in 1979, the Fed had to make that exact brutal trade-off. President Jimmy Carter brought in a new Fed chair, Paul Volcker, to tame out-of-control inflation. Volcker did something unprecedented and totally shocking. He raised interest rates to nearly 20%. Just look at that number, 20%. This extreme move violently spiked unemployment above 10%. As you can imagine, the American public was absolutely furious with the Federal Reserve.
I mean, home builders and auto workers were so devastated by these 20% interest rates that they literally started mailing 2x4s and car keys to the Fed headquarters, protesting that homes and cars simply couldn't be sold anymore. Tractors even circled their building in protest. But Volcker held firm. Today, he's actually lionized in economic circles because his politically independent, highly unpopular decisions were absolutely necessary. It crushed the inflation and set the U.S. up for 30 years of strong economic performance. It proved beyond a doubt that the chaperone sometimes has to be willing to be the bad guy. That hard-won credibility really set the stage for the modern era. Welcome to Section 5, the new crisis playbook of 2008 and COVID-19. When the 2008 financial crisis threatened to completely collapse the global economy, the Fed, led by Chairman Ben Bernanke, was determined not to repeat the inaction of the Great Depression. So instead of doing nothing, Bernanke threw absolutely everything at the wall. First, they did the unthinkable, dropping interest rates to near zero for the very first time in history. By making money essentially free to borrow, they aggressively tried to jumpstart the frozen engine of the economy. But even that wasn't enough.
They also stepped way outside their traditional bounds. Instead of just being a bank for banks, the Fed suddenly started acting as a backstop for the wider financial system, loaning massive amounts of money directly to non-banks. They became this ultimate safety net for institutions they had never, ever directly supported before. And they weren't even further. They actively entered completely new markets, buying up massive amounts of assets like mortgage securities. This wasn't just adjusting a dial anymore. This was the Fed actively and forcibly pumping cash directly into the struggling economy to keep the whole financial system from drowning. And we saw exactly how permanent this new playbook was just over a decade later. When COVID-19 shut down the world, the Fed didn't hesitate. They immediately dusted off this exact same aggressive strategy. They bought the same assets, loaned to even more non-banks, and drastically increased the money in circulation. The money printer truly went burr all over again. It proved definitively that the modern Fed is willing to do whatever it absolutely takes, stretching its power as far as humanly possible to hold the system together during a national emergency. But that begs the question, why does the Fed have to do all this heavy lifting? That brings us to our final section, the only game in town, and outsourcing the economy. Following the 2008 crisis, deep political gridlock meant Congress just wouldn't pass new spending bills. If the economy needed stimulating, our elected officials simply wouldn't agree to do it. So, by default of their inaction, the burden fell almost entirely on the Federal Reserve. They literally became known in financial circles as the only game in town. Today, financial markets hang on every single utterance, every sigh, every word of the Fed chair. Because Congress is deadlocked, monetary policy, which is controlled exclusively by the Fed, has become the undisputed primary manager of the entire U.S. economic outlook. They are the ultimate, essential stopgap for the entire system. Which brings our explainer full circle to that deeply important question we started with. What happens if nobody controls the money? Is it actually safe to outsource the economy to an unelected chaperone? Over the decades, our elected leaders in the White House and Congress have essentially decided that it's just easier to rely on a handful of unelected officials to make these monumental, rapid-fire decisions without the fear of political fallout. But as the Fed's power grows with every single crisis, we really have to ask ourselves, are we comfortable leaving the keys to the entire global economy in the hands of the chaperone? Definitely something to think about the next time you look at a dollar bill. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.